an education in the humanities is absolutely essential. I mean, do you want somebody who is working on AI to never have studied Frankenstein or
Right.
New Atlantis or something along those lines, right? Like, and grappled with the questions that those great works of art and literature raise? We need a thick, rich education in the humanities for our children, really now more than ever.
Welcome to the Napa Legal Podcast, where we cover religious liberty, particularly from the perspective of faith-based nonprofit organizations. I'm Frank DeVito, Senior Counsel and Director of Content at Napa Legal. And this week, we're going to go a little off of our normal religious liberty updates for a special episode. So I'm happy to welcome Jason Bedrick to join me as our guest for today's podcast. Jason is a research fellow in the Center for Education Policy at the Heritage Foundation. A lot of overlap. He focuses on policies that promote education freedom, religious liberty, classical education, and restoring the primary role of families in education, all topics that we have covered extensively here at Napa Legal. And in particular, Jason was instrumental in the work on the Phoenix Declaration, which we covered, I believe it was last week on the podcast, when Florida had recently adopted this for their school district. So we're happy to have you on, Jason. Thank you for being here to talk about this.
Thank you so much for having me, Frank.
Yeah, you're most welcome. So I guess before we get into some of the issues surrounding the Phoenix Declaration, I was just wondering, would you give us a little more about what you do at Heritage on education policy? Because it's so central to the flourishing of religion in public life, to religious liberty. There's a lot of overlap with education policy. So I'd love to hear some of what you're focused on there at Heritage.
Sure. So I've been involved in primarily the school choice movement for the past 20 years. And my main focus had been for a long time just ensuring that families had access to the schools that work best for their children and other learning environments. You know, that could be homeschooling, that could be at a private school, could be a charter school, could be some combination of the above. But, you know, starting around, I'd say about 5 years ago, I realized that really wasn't enough, that school choice was a necessary condition to improve education in this country, but not a sufficient condition. And I felt that the conservative movement wasn't doing enough to talk about what sort of schools families should be choosing. Now, obviously, we want an education system. We want, from the government's perspective, essentially, we want the government to be agnostic about what families choose. We don't want the government saying, you know, picking winners and losers, saying you can choose these types and you can't choose those types. We want freedom and pluralism. America is founded on freedom and pluralism, and we want an education system that respects and reflects that freedom and pluralism. But as conservatives, we should, in the free market of ideas, be saying to parents, look, there are better and worse options, right? There are some schools that are going to form your child in a way that nourishes his or her soul. Because we're not just looking for schools that produce kids who are college and career ready, right? We don't want just schools that are producing good workers. We want schools that are producing good friends, good neighbors, good people. And some schools are better suited to that than others. And so conservatives need to take these things more seriously. And so that's been something I've been working on at Heritage. And in some sense, the Phoenix Declaration is the fruit of that.
I really like what you said generally, and this applies to education, and I really like that distinction, and even more generally in the conservative movement, to make sure that we distinguish that freedom is for the good, right? We want freedom so that we can pursue what is good and what is true, not for the license to just do whatever we feel like. So that's great, because on one hand, you're right, we live in a pluralistic society, very important to have choices, especially when the default of public education is not often the best choice, or maybe hardly ever the best choice. But also that, yeah, to be promoting better choices and the fact that they exist, right? It's not a pure agnostic decision, even if the government should be agnostic. So that's a really good backdrop. So yeah, can you tell me a little bit about the Phoenix Declaration, how it came about first, and then we'll talk a little bit more about what's in there?
Sure. So in 2024, we held our first Conservative Vision of Education conference, and it was hosted in Phoenix, Arizona, which is my adopted hometown. And we had a whole bunch of different policymakers, policy wonks, educators, academics, etc., come together to Phoenix to hash it out over a variety of different issues. The focus being coming up with an affirmative vision of education, right? What I felt the conservative, one of the problems with conservatives generally is that we're often much better at explaining what we're against than what we're for.
Yeah.
And so in that sense, there's, it's more reactive than proactive. But all of the things that we are against, when we say that we're against CRT and DEI, we're against radical gender ideology, right? Well, why are we against these things? Well, really, it's because we are for something that we weren't fully articulating. Uh, and so I brought these people together. And out of this, we put together a drafting committee that came up with this declaration that we unveiled earlier this year, um, I think February, maybe early March of 2025, with these 7 different planks of the Phoenix Declaration. So parental choice and responsibility, transparency and accountability, truth and goodness, cultural transmission, character formation, academic excellence, and citizenship. And so we believe that these are the core purposes of education, and that if schools and school districts and policymakers are attending to these things, then like the phoenix, the mythical bird that emerges from the ashes of its former self, we could have a real renewal of America's education system, not just raising test scores, but also producing children who are fully prepared as adults for the responsibilities of adulthood, and that they can attend the blessings of liberty and keep the republic, which I really do fear that we are in jeopardy of losing.
Yeah. Now, this is really interesting. You make a good point about the conservatives being better at articulating what we're against, and I think that's especially true on education because I think there was a lot of conservatives were maybe blindsided by, wokeism, DEI, CRT, the 1619 Project, all of these things. And I wonder, I'm curious if you have a thought on this, if maybe conservatives were not kind of tricked by this idea of neutrality in school subjects that, oh, school is just to teach history. You just read history, or English. You just learn how to read and write and arithmetic, and as if you can have neutral education, which you really can't, right? Because every curriculum, every seemingly neutral subject still involves choices about what you're teaching, what texts you're using, what methodologies, and so on. And there's really no such thing as an ideologically neutral education. It seems like we were kind of late to the party to wake up here. Do you think there's something to that?
Yes, 100%. I've said this 1,000 times myself. There's no such thing as a values neutral classroom. There just isn't. I wouldn't use the word tricked. I think that, as schools secularized in the early 20th century and into the mid 20th century, we really did have this moment where we thought we could have something that was more value neutral. So the values is something that we're going to teach nights and weekends, and schools are not, schools are going to be value neutral. I think really a lot of people really did believe that. It just is not sustainable. And even the choice to remove certain values, or what we used to call virtues, from the classroom is a value laden decision.
Yeah.
It's saying that these sorts of things aren't something that we're supposed to discuss in polite company, right? And so there's the whole hidden curriculum issue there. And it creates a vacuum that is inevitably filled. And I think the left just did a much better job of filling it, because most children are in a government run unionized system. The unions are working hand in glove with other elements of the left that were happy to provide the value content for those schools. And conservatives for a long time just kind of shrugged their shoulders and said, what can I do? Like, there's nothing I can really do about this. And you just sort of like get accustomed to it. Um, but I think we've begun to realize the fruits of that decision, and that the core of conservatism has to be conserving a culture, right? That's why we put in the very center of all these principles is cultural transmission. Uh, and we write the central purpose of education is to transmit humanity's accumulated knowledge and wisdom, as well as our nation's particular culture and heritage to the next generation. A civilization survives only if it intentionally transmits its history, traditions, and values, including its yet unrealized aspirations, to the next generation. True progress comes only by building on what has been learned and achieved in the past. Students should therefore learn about America's founding principles and roots in the broader Western and Judeo-Christian traditions. Students should study the best that has been thought and said, engaging in the great conversation among the competing viewpoints that comprise our intellectual heritage, so that they may freely make their best views their own. This is at the center of education. It gives the, when you think about character formation, well, what kind of virtues are you trying to cultivate? What kind of heroes are you teaching our children about, right? When you think about academic excellence, what that looks like, what sort of content knowledge children have to master, that all comes from cultural transmission. Even our understanding of truth and goodness comes from our particular cultural transmission. So all of these things are interrelated, and we thought it was important that as a movement, we come together and articulate this. But I should note this too. The conference was called the Conservative Vision of Education Conference, but the Phoenix Declaration, the subtitle is An American Vision for Education. It is not explicitly conservative. We believe that there are those on the left who could equally embrace a commitment to truth, goodness, character formation, academic excellence, citizenship, etc. They're going to have a different idea of how those principles turn into policy, but we can agree on the principles. And that's why in the preamble, we intentionally cite John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, right? Two founding fathers that are sort of at the opposite poles of the founding project, who are equally committed to those principles. We want to reach out our hand to the left. Some of those on the left, right? Those on the left who think of those who are in the mold of like Martin Luther King, or Frederick Douglass, who were critics, so harsh critics of America, but they're critics within the tradition. They're critics who say, we believe in the founding principles. We believe in the principles that are articulated in the Declaration of Independence. And the problem is that we have not fully lived up to those principles. That's why we note that we have to transmit our traditions and values and unrealized aspirations. Like there are a lot of unrealized aspirations at the founding era. Those are critics within the tradition, but those who are coming from like the 1619 Project, they're saying, no, the founding principles were wrong. America's central institutions, its constitution, its declaration, the government that flow from them, they're all inherently racist. We need to rip them up and start over from year one. Those are revolutionaries who are coming from outside the tradition. I think the post-liberals on the far right, you could say the same thing. They want to tear it all down and rebuild it, as something that's thrown in altar, blood and soil, which are, European versions of conservatism, not American versions of conservatism.
Yeah, there's there's a lot I could dig into here. That was really, really helpful overview. One thing that I think is really interesting, both in the choice of what you focused on in these seven kind of principles, but also what you had said about kind of extending an olive branch, if you will, to some people on the left on how to move forward in education. The pillar on truth and goodness. I think this is incredibly important. This is the first thing that struck me when I was reading about the Phoenix Declaration. This idea, I'll just read it, it's short. Right. Education must be grounded in truth. Students should learn that there is objective truth and that it is knowable. Science courses must be grounded in reality, not ideological fads. Students should learn that good and evil exist and that human beings have the capacity and duty to choose good. I was thinking of this passage again when you were just talking about, people on the left, like in the tradition of a Martin Luther King. If you have strong left of center civil rights beliefs about racism, what have you, you still need to affirm what's in this pillar, that
That's
there
right.
is objective good and truth that exist. Otherwise, why would anybody care about even your civil rights project, right? You say, well, black people, brown people, certain people in the classes in this society are being treated badly. Like, okay, But if
what's
you
good
don't
and
accept
bad.
the truth and goodness exists, like I don't have to believe everyone's equal. I don't, there have to be axioms of truth, right? First principles that come before scientific hypotheses instead that we can actually lay down and agree on, or else none of this works, left, right, or center. So I really like that this is a pillar in this project. I don't know if you want to elaborate. I would love to hear what you have to
I
say.
think that's 100% correct. I mean, you can't even have an education if first you don't have a commitment to truth, because then what are you passing on? What are you teaching? If it's all just a point of view, then why are we passing on anything? Why are we trying to teach kids anything? It's based on them, not some outside knowledge. And I know, look, a lot of the critics of the Phoenix Declaration have honed in on this, and they get very nervous about this part, because they say, "Oh, this is going to be indoctrination," right?
Mhm.
Look, what's going on in the public school systems to a great extent is indoctrination. Indoctrination is where the teacher is presenting one point of view and is expecting students to accept it unquestioningly. We are not looking to replace left-wing indoctrination with right-wing indoctrination, right? We want to pass on a tradition, which is a tradition of debate, right? You've got Republicans and Democrats, Federalists and anti-Federalists, progressives and conservatives. They are all a part of this broad Judeo-Christian Western tradition. And we even say that, like I said, students should engage in the great conversation among the competing viewpoints that comprise our intellectual heritage. It was important that we put that in the document. But if we don't have a certain commitment to truth, if we can't say, yes, 2 + 2 = 4, that is objectively true. There are certain things that are objectively true, and we have to be able to agree on those things. Then we can, there are, of course, our subjective interpretations of what those facts mean, how they should be interpreted, how you turn these principles into policy. We're going to have that debate. But at the center, we have to say, yes, there is something called truth, there is something called goodness. And, the abolitionists, if they don't believe in good and evil, what do they have? Same as you pointed out with the civil rights movement. And this also relates again to this idea of cultural transmission. What do we see as the good at the center of our culture? So the idea that all human beings are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, right? That's where our idea of goodness flows from. And the equal dignity of all human beings comes from our particular Judeo-Christian understanding of what the good is.
Yeah. No, that's absolutely right. I was going to use the first two kind of principles of speculative and practical reason, right? Principle of non-contradiction. You should do, and then on the other side, you should do good and avoid evil. But the inalienable rights in the Declaration is another great example. Like these things are true, and they're central to everything that flows forth in education and our understanding of America. You can't prove them. Um, they're first principles. And
That's right.
I think, like you said, it's not an indoctrination in some scary right-wing, religious fanatic sense. But at the end of the day, you have to have first principles that you give to students from which they can understand everything they're doing. There have to be some.
Yes, and so that's why we say, this is an American vision of education, right?
Right.
In other words, the founding principles are the ones that we essentially take as axiomatic.
Yeah.
But again, there is a tradition of debate about those ideas. So we're not just saying you must accept this unquestioningly, right? We are introducing them to a debate. The Federalists and Anti-Federalists disagreed over the Constitution itself, right? Both drawing on principles that they all agreed to.
Mhm.
So again, that is a form of education. Introducing them to that intellectual heritage and these competing viewpoints is education, not indoctrination.
Right. I would love to just spend a long amount of time going through these pillars. There's so much richness here, but I encourage anybody who's listening should go and read. And you can go on the Heritage Phoenix Declaration page and you can read the vision. It's not very long, it's very rich. I would encourage everyone to do that. I want to turn a little bit towards some of the practical implications of this. So, first of all, as we said at the beginning, Florida adopted this declaration. Can you speak a little bit to, I mean, if you know how that came about or what you think that means for Florida's schools?
Look, Florida. has been on the cutting edge in so many different policy areas. It says something that their state board of education unanimously adopted this, and I attribute that really um, to their commissioner of education, and also to Ryan Petty, who is on their state board of education. He's the chair of their state board of education. They were driving this really hard. Uh, but what I think it says is, look, I think this is going to help set the agenda in Florida. Um, the left has done a much better job, again, on utilizing symbols, because some people
Mhm.
have said, okay, well, this is it's just a resolution or a declaration. Like it's ephemeral. It doesn't actually have any policies that directly flow from it. Shouldn't we just be like passing bills? No, we actually have to do both. The left got normal, not very political people to commit themselves to diversity, equity, and inclusion before they understood that the way they were defining those three terms, which almost everybody is in favor, who's against diversity, who's against inclusion, right?
Right.
It's only when you realize, oh, they're defining these terms in a way that most Americans don't mean by these terms. And then they're already implementing policies that flow from it. Then you have this work of like trying to unwind what they're doing. So it's a similar thing here, except we're being much more open. We're defining our terms in this particular document. It's very interesting to me that everybody I've seen, literally to a person, who has criticized this document has said, well, everything they write in it sounds nice, but they really mean this other thing over here.
Yeah.
Like over and over, they're like, what they really mean is they want a whitewashed history that whitewashes slavery and segregation. No, we want them to deal honestly with slavery and segregation and Jim Crow. We just believe that even after all of that, as we put it in the document itself, students should learn the whole truth about America, its merits and failings, without obscuring that America is a great source for good in the world and that we have a tradition that is worth passing on. And we believe that an honest assessment of American history will bear that out. Um, so yeah, I forget the question at this point, but I hope I answered it.
Yeah, I'll dig in a little more on the policy. That's a great start. So I think my question is I mean, going forward is what we think will happen from here, right? Because like
Mhm.
you said, you have these school districts and these and leadership and teachers and administrators who have been on a different track than what the Phoenix Declaration proposes for quite
That's right.
some time. So policy implementation of something like this in a place like Florida, cutting edge of good educational reform, what do you think that will look like in the coming
Yeah.
years? What are the challenges? What are the first steps?
So I think the first steps, we'd like to see as many local school boards as possible around the country adopt this or
Mhm.
some version of it. And then once they've adopted that, first of all, it's a shield against bad ideas. So the next time the left comes with their new acronym, which is a repackaging of very old and bad ideas, um, we'll be able to say, okay, we've already committed ourselves to this. These are the principles that we're committed to. What you're proposing sounds nice on some level, but it contradicts what we're already about, which is this. So thank you, but no thank you. The other thing is it really will help set the agenda. And we've come up with a whole list of questions that school board members can be asking their superintendents and the principals that report to them. So let's just take character formation, right? What are we doing in this school to advance character formation? What kind of virtues are we trying to instill? What teacher prep programs do we have to ensure that the teachers are on board with this? How are we measuring this, if at all? Uh, and every minute that is spent on this is a minute that those administrators are not spending implementing some DEI thing or whatever, right? This is the way we set an agenda. And we have to, totally reframe how we understand education in order to do that.
Yeah. So I guess the skeptic's the wrong word. The cynic in me thinks that it's a great start, but I've been around school boards, I've been around school solicitors, and there's a really hard problem that it's very hard to implement good policies over bad teachers, frankly.
Mhm.
So I'm wondering, is there thought about or plan for something like the Phoenix Declaration to be implemented and taken to schools of education? Because I think reforming the teachers seems to be a necessity to get actual policy changes in schools.
Yes. I don't know of any schools of education that are right now ready to adopt the Phoenix Declaration. What I can say is that James Schools, who's he's from the Civic Center at Florida State University, he and I are co-authoring a book called The Phoenix Principles. It should be out in uh, probably June with
Okay.
Encounter Books. And really, I should say we're co-editing because it's an edited volume. Each of these principles is going to have somebody writing about it. Great folks, Robert Pondicio, Yuval Levin, Mark Bauerlein, Melissa Muscala. I mean, some really heavy hitters are Matthew Meehan from Hillsdale are going to, each of them have one chapter on one of the principles. And so they're laying the intellectual case. And James is also working to establish essentially like the Federalist Society for education schools, right? So if you look around the law schools in this country, almost all of them are to the left. You've got a handful that are a little more heterodox, like, Antonin Scalia Law School at George Mason, but almost all of them are to the left. And nevertheless, the Federalist Society uh, really is, I think, the most effective conservative organization in the last 4 or 5 decades on the right. And they did that not by trying to affect policy directly. What they did is they got people from a variety of different streams of originalism and textualism and had them debate with each other and really, iron sharpens iron, hone their ideas, create this sort of intellectual culture. They're committed to the same principles. They have different ideas of how they should be put into practice. And eventually they take over the judiciary and they set it back on the right course even though it had gone astray. And how do they set it back on the right course? By restoring it to the founding principles. It's the same sort of thing that we need to do in education. We're not going to take over the ed schools, but if we've got chapters in ed schools across the country filled with people who are committed to these principles and who disagree on how to put the principles into practice and argue and hash it out, I think that we're going to have a vibrant intellectual culture that could help eventually right what's wrong in our school system.
That's a brilliant insight. I've been saying this to whoever will listen for years, that, love or hate the Federalist Society. And of course, people with different policy desires will have mixed reactions to how this or that Federalist Society judge ruled on this or that case. But you're right. On the whole, you took an institution completely dominated by the left, seeded starting on the grassroots level in the schools, and have created a movement that's transformed the judiciary. And
Mhm.
yeah, 40 years. So I think that's a model for any institutional reform, recapture, whatever you want to call it. So that's a brilliant insight, and I look forward to seeing how that plays out. Um, any final thoughts that you want to share about where you think this movement's going? Maybe what else you're working on? Anything you'd like to wrap up with?
I think I want to say one word about academic excellence, which is one of the planks of the Phoenix Declaration. But for a lot of people, academic excellence just means teaching skills and leaving it at that. And I strenuously disagree. As we put it, schools should prioritize a rigorous and content-rich curriculum rooted in foundational subjects such as math, literature, science, history, civics, and the arts. Okay. Um, First, there are too many people who say you don't need to know anything anymore. You don't need to teach kids facts. They're just going to Google it. But the reality is, if you don't have certain mental furniture, you don't even know what to Google. When you hear something that somebody says, you don't even know what to look up. If they're talking about the Second World War or if they're talking about the founding era, you, you don't even know how to process that information or what to Google. So we need to have certain facts. The other thing is this. I think too many on the right have said, well, the left has taken over the humanities. We just need to abandon it. We need to focus on, the three R's and STEM, right? Let's get these kids, just teach them skills and anything that might have um, content that the left could subvert to push their ideology. We're going to get that out. that fails in a number of ways. First, they're already sticking that stuff into math classes, right?
Right.
So that already fails. But the other thing is we have to take these things seriously. Our entire culture is in history and literature and art, and we are living in a time when even a justice of the Supreme Court can't answer the question, what is a woman? Okay. Very soon, people are going to find that they are struggling to answer the question, what is a human? Right? It's not just transgender, it's transhuman. We're getting there. So an education in the humanities is absolutely essential. I mean, do you want somebody who is working on AI to never have studied uh, uh, Frankenstein or
Right.
New Atlantis or something along those lines, right? Like, and grappled with the questions that those great works of art and literature raise. We need a thick, rich um, education in the humanities for our children, really now more than ever.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that, and that goes across the board, right? You have from even people who will not be doing intellectual work in their professional lives, just man is an intellectual creature. And so cultivating the life of the mind is just part of living a good life. And you see, right, the early Americans, you had these kind of yeoman farmers, right, who they all were familiar with the scriptures and they were all familiar with Shakespeare. There was like this huge culture of learning among the peasants. And then all the way up to, I would love to see a renewal of yeah, professional life. The sciences and the arts all influence each other, right? One of my great intellectual inspirations is a priest named Sertalange. I don't know if you're familiar with. He wrote a little book called The Intellectual Life, but he talks about the genius and the necessity of people who cultivate an intellectual life to have this balance between generalization and specialization. It's like, listen, a scientist who knows nothing of poetry, nothing of history, nothing of philosophy, like you were saying, is not a good scientist, right? So you have to drill deep into your subject, but you need to have a broad base to be an intellectual, but also just to be a human. So I love this vision, and thank you so much for your work on this.
Well, again, thank you for having me on the podcast.
Yeah, I know you're welcome anytime. So thank you to our listeners for joining us for this special episode of the Napa Legal Podcast. Thank you, Jason, for being here, and we hope you all will join us next time. Thank you so much, and God bless you.